welcome back to my channel. I've been getting quite a few requests for tutorials and different on different illustration styles that I do, so I thought today I'd walk you through a piece of art that I've made for my Instagram and show you exactly how I go about achieving this style of artwork. So I've already done a really rough sketch, which I started with a quote. I made this one up, I think I did, you never really know, and I listed out words that I associated with it. In this case it was the word magic in particular, and I came up with different symbols of nature, witchy sort of women, and the sun and the moon and stuff like that. So I always start by sketching out a rough composition, which I like to keep really loose and rough so I can sort of make things up as I go. It's really different when I do client work because, you know, you have to go back and forth with different sketches, and usually it's a lot more refined at this stage. Usually, it's always a lot more refined at this stage, but when I'm working on pieces for myself, I just like to keep that element of freedom in there. I think it's more fun and it gives a bit of surprise even to me to what the end result is going to be. So I drop the opacity on the sketch layers, and I make a new layer underneath those so I can always see my sketch underneath. I start with the background colour and then I move to drawing the largest elements first. So in terms of brushes, for a really long time, in fact probably close to a year, my favourite brush for big colour areas was the Procreate default dry ink, but lately I've become obsessed with the 6B pencil. It's also a Procreate default, but I just really like a really defined texture, and it's a bit scratchy and there's a bit areas, like if you reduce the pressure as you're drawing, there's little parts that are a bit more see-through than others, and I think that it gives a really nice effect because I really like textured work. I think I need to get an Apple pencil grip though, because now that I'm watching back I can see why I have calluses on my fingers. So I work through my pieces section by section, and I try to keep things on separate layers as much as possible so that way it's easy to go back and edit. I decided to make the leaves really dark as they sit over the sun, so you probably, if you think about the elements in real life, you wouldn't see much detail. Like the leaves would mostly be black if they were directly in front of the sun. I also think it gives it a really striking look, having that quite severe level of contrast. So I fill in all of the elements one by one because it really does give it that individual hand-drawn feel, like you're actually, you know, using a pencil on paper. I also have a paper-like screen protector which makes it kind of feel like I'm using a pencil on paper. They're a lot of fun. And I actually, now that I'm watching the video back, I kind of realise how often I love that iPad Procreate has, like, you double tap if you want to go back and redo something, but now that I'm watching it, I can see how many times my palm hits the iPad and it thinks that I'm double tapping and it goes back, and then if you make another stroke, it, like, you can't go forward again. And now watching it, I can see how annoying it is. It happens so often that it's just become a reflex for me to ignore it, so I don't really notice it too much. And I don't want to turn off the double tap function because I really like it. But yeah, that's frustrating. So if I have elements like this, I will often duplicate and adjust the size and adjust the rotation. I think that, you know, if you put so much effort into an individual piece, you may as well, if you can, use them more than once. And honestly, it gives the pieces quite a nice sense of symmetry. So you can see with the clouds as well that it's quite an organic process. Like I have rough shapes sort of sketched out that I use as a base, which is mainly just to know, like, roughly where things will be and also what content is actually going to be in the piece, but pretty much none of the shapes are finalized, and I really just play it by ear and work with whatever feels good in the moment. Funnily enough, the sketch actually takes me about as long as the finished artwork does, because that's the point where you're trying to make all of the creative decisions really, and you're deciding what's going to go in the piece, where is it going to be, what's the quote going to say, what style of type are you going to use. So the sketch is like, sometimes it can be like, 2 hours of just messing around with different sketches trying to get something that I think will work before I even start on a final. So I'm using this all blue colour palette for a long time, and actually this is one of my tips for Instagram for making your feed look cohesive. If you don't feel like you have a consistent style, my easiest tip for you is to stick to like 3 or 4 different color schemes and just continually repeat them. So like if you do follow me, creativewannabe_ on Instagram, and you go back into my profile, you'll sort of see that I had probably 3 or 4 really distinct color schemes that I used all the time. It was like a gold black and white, a purple black and white, like a blue and orange, and like a pale pink sort of scheme, and most of my work sort of centered around those. I might be missing one, but they're the main ones I can think of. And so I'm trying to, at this point, branch out a little bit with my colors and use a bit more vibrant colors, because all my colors are really muted. But I'm using these, I didn't realize you could buy them until recently. You can purchase palettes like already made, because color selection is something that I really enjoy. Like I like doing it, but sometimes you just don't have time, and sometimes you need other ideas. And so this was a lot of fun. This was one by Visual Timmy, I think, and it came with maybe like 8 or 9 different palettes. So I'm using this all blue one. So because I work on different layers and I try to separate stuff out as much as possible, it means that in a lot of instances you don't necessarily have to be all within the lines. Like the hair is probably pretty important here because it's going over the top, but for the skin it doesn't actually matter. So just fill in the detail bit by bit. It really is a super manual process. Just reworking on the lines until I'm happy, and all the shapes until I'm happy. My other tip is if you find that you use actually a brush really regularly, so in this instance the 6B pencil, what I like to do, and when I say what I like to do, I mean I worked out to do this while I was making this piece. Like I was like, oh, probably because I was conscious that I was filming it and other people might watch it. I was like, maybe I should make 2 brushes, because I have one where the streamline effect is turned up to 100, and I have one where it's turned down to 0, and they're pretty much the only streamline effects that I use. And so it was a case of, well, why don't I duplicate the brush and make one of them always streamlined and one of them always not, rather than having to keep going into the brush menu and change it. Revolutionary, in my opinion. It honestly made life so much easier, and I don't know why it's taken me over a year to think about doing that, but it has. So you know what, save yourself some time. If you use brushes really regularly, duplicate them and change whatever settings you usually change, and just have multiple copies of them. So I tend to always, you'll notice here that I like zooming out quite often and then zooming back in. I find, and this was something I learned in design school, because I went to uni to get a degree in graphic design, and actually my first job out of uni was as a web designer. One of the things that they taught us was to always pin your work up on a board and stand right back from it, because seeing it smaller gives you a really good idea of the overall composition, where your eye is being drawn to first, and I find it really helpful in being able to see the overall effectiveness of a piece. So I like to, actually the other thing you can do is if you're in like Photoshop or something, you can flip the canvas, so that way it changes something in your brain, because you're so used to seeing it one way and you think that you're supposed to be seeing it one way, that when it's different or it's smaller, you start seeing it as shapes rather than getting caught up on the individual details. So I like to zoom out when I'm working quite regularly and check the progress of the piece to make sure that it's still fitting the idea that I sort of had in my head when I started. So with these two sort of female figures in the illustration, I thought it'd be really nice. I really like having symmetry where I can, and so the one way to differentiate it is just to reverse out the colours. So whatever you do for one, do the opposite for other, and it makes them look very related and very like they're, you know, part of a set, but it also gives them distinct personalities while still fitting into the colour scheme, because they do still match each other. It's a nice little nod to, you know, the sun and the moon as well, and I just think that that look is really effective, particularly for the kind of style that I like to illustrate in regularly. So I'm playing all of this footage at, I think, 250% of the speed. So the actual piece ended up taking me, like an hour and a half to colour, and this is quite a fast one because I had a really clear idea from the beginning. This is also after the sketch phase. So you can see that this process is fairly manual, and that's why I tend to try and duplicate as many elements as I can, like these stars, like the clouds. You know, if you have them there, it's nice when parts you're working in a really quite loose illustration style and then parts of your illustration are uniform. I think it just adds more of a structure to the piece. I'm a sucker for little stars or little polka dots and just filling up the space. I think it's quite, it's something that I've built into my own personal style quite consistently. Like, give me a little bit of space and some dots, and that's what I like. That's what I like doing. It's a lot of fun. So when I move to the section for lettering the quote, which I always pretty much leave last, I'll work through it in sections, and I'll usually turn on the grid function in Procreate. And if I'm not doing that, then I have a set of grid brushes by Stephen Kuntz and Ian Barnard, the letter builder and grid builder brushes. And so if it's not straight, I'll use the grids from there, or I'll draw out my own grids. But in this instance, because the style of type I was going for is quite simple, the Procreate grids would do the job perfectly. And so what I'll do is, if I have the really rough sketch to start with, I'll go and do a less rough outline of the letters, and I'll copy letters to make sure they're consistent and uniform, and I'll lay them out properly, I'll space them out reasonably properly, and I'll just finalize the shapes, because then I'll put another layer over the top of that to draw the shapes properly. There's a lot of different ways that you can go about drawing letters, but for this piece in particular I decided to keep it quite a fun, cute, and I suppose a bit irregular style. So I'll place it in the middle, work out where it is. I'll count the grid on either side to make sure it's perfectly centered. And then I'll get another layer, drop the opacity on my refined sketch layer, and I'll start going over it again. So it took me a little while to work out exactly how I wanted to go about doing these letters. I couldn't decide if I wanted to have a brush the same width and, you know, raise off the ends to make square corners, or... So there's still an element of playing around, but I ended up settling on one of my favourite lettering styles, which is one that I recently illustrated a book, a reflection journal, which is out on Amazon. It's called True You, which I did for that, which is quite uneven, hand-drawn, sort of wonky lettering. And so you do that with this like crisscrossing pattern, which keeps the width of each stroke semi-consistent, but there is differentiation between the letters because you're not using like a letter builder and you're not using just one weight of brush, which is kind of nice, I think. So yeah, I'll also duplicate letters wherever possible. It saves time, number one, and number two, it gives a bit of consistency to an otherwise fairly inconsistent type style. And you'll notice here I'm looking at the section where each of the down sort of stems join with the top part to make sure that they're not completely even, but they're semi-even. One thing I really like to do with all of my letters, I think it just makes it look a bit more polished, is to clean up the corners and the tops like I just did then. I think it's just helpful in adding a bit of refinement to the overall look. I probably should have done it to the sides with the E, but you know, you don't always remember these things. So another handy tip is wherever you can, try to find letters that you've already made that can be then turned into other letters in the same sense of like the duplicating elements. You know, an O can become a G and a C, and E can become an F, or vice versa. You know, an I can become the downstroke of any letter. And I think that just helps create some degree of consistency as well in the weight, in the way the corners sit, in the curve if it's an O or a C. And so this is, sorry, I think I forgot to mention before, I switched back for the lettering to the dry ink pen, which is the Procreate default. I just find that when it comes to letters, having a sharp edge often looks a bit nicer. It looks a bit more refined, and I don't like the letters in particular looking fuzzy. So while I'm really liking the 6B pencil for everything else, dry ink or the brush pen, or the studio pen, sorry, are all my kind of go-tos. Visual Timmy has a really nice vector lettering set. I know I'm mentioning him again, but I just bought his like extra large bundle the other day of Procreate brushes, and I'm sort of like loving that. So, but my go-tos are the free default ones. So in my opinion, you don't really need to buy, with the exception of maybe some textures, you don't really need to buy any brushes. So I had to take a break because my camera battery went dead, so I'm back at it now. There's been a lot of progress, but you'll notice here actually that I hadn't planned this section of the illustration out, and now you'll see what takes so long is I have to try and work out what's going to fit there and what I want to put there. And I actually spent a long time just staring at it before I turned the camera back on as well, going, what do I do? Because I wasn't expecting there to be such a gap. So I decided on these like fern bushes, which have a semi sort of symmetry to them as well. If this was not for Instagram, this would, I would definitely plan this all out quite detailed, but because it's just for my own stuff, it's fine to mess around and play around with it a bit. And so I decided to add these little cute little flowers onto it, again with the dots. Love the little dots, I think they're so cute. So once I've got all of the base color down, I go and start adding in details, and I'll usually do this again on separate layers, and I'll add the layers as a clipping mask. So for this, it'll be the leaves, details on the figures. Sometimes there's more than that, but in this instance there's actually not too much that needs additional line work. So then I went and added the expressions on the face, and you'll see that I actually had a lot of difficulty with this and trying to work out the proper colours that I should do this on. I'm a sucker for, I'll just add in as well, for dots on cheeks. I just think there's something so folksy and I suppose sort of traditional about it. I love it. So I'll add them in as a clipping mask as well. And so this is where I found I started having trouble, because you can see why I'm hesitating for so long. It's because when I zoomed out, the main thing that I could notice was the white details of the face, and there was just something about it that automatically drew my eye to that corner, and I think detracted from the overall piece. Like, it was just, I think the contrast was so striking, sort of in reverse, that I decided to go and do all of the other details. But the whole time I was doing the other details, I was thinking, what about that face in particular that was causing all of my attention to go straight there. I also just felt that having the white details on the face wasn't doing the face justice. So I decided to leave it because I couldn't figure out how to fix it at the moment, and I started adding in textures. So after I've added in all the little line details, I'll usually go through and add textures, and this is quite a intuitive process as well. Actually, even when it comes to client work, this is quite an intuitive process because the sketches never entirely reflect textures. But I really like my work to look really layered and have lots of depth and look like there are a lot of physical qualities to them, like tactile qualities. That's what I'm thinking of. And so I'll generally go and do quite a few different texture layers, and I'll change the blending mode so you can see I'm putting it on the dresses there, and I'll try to find something that shows up on both. And I really like that sort of grungy, a bit distressed look. So I just work through all the elements one by one, adding textures to each of them and then sort of dropping the opacity, and it creates a really nice layered look. Oh, I love how the moon and the sun and the clouds look with texture on them, and even the plants. And so at this point I was thinking about two things. Number one was the face, on the dark blue skin girl. And number two was that I was struggling to see the differentiation in the word we between we and the cloud. And so one way, and one of my favorite things to do with letters is to create 3D letters with a shadow. And that's a good way of adding in that extra, I suppose, separateness and distinctness. So I decided to go and do that. And the easiest way to do that is to duplicate your lettering, fill it with the darker or lighter with your new color, and then to go and fill in the little gaps where it doesn't, like, needs to match up, which is actually it's pretty reminiscent of how we were taught to do it. Again, when I was back at uni, you would have to do your lettering on a sheet of paper, or tracing paper, and then you'd have to go and copy it again onto another sheet of tracing paper, and you'd stack those two together and move one of them over slightly, and then you'd copy the whole thing onto a new sheet of paper. So it's just I think a bit more eco and time effective way of doing that process, and it ensures that your angles are perfect every single time. So I was still thinking about the face, and I was still thinking about what I could do to make it look less jarring. So I tried, I wasn't sure, was it the brush? Was it because it was so sketchy? Maybe it was that. But then, changing the brush didn't fix it, and having more defined lines didn't fix it. And all of these, I'll mention, these are all on new layers. That way at any point I can just get rid of the layer. I haven't made any changes that I can't undo. It's an easy fix. And then I thought maybe I need to add a little pupil, maybe that's what it is. And then I thought maybe the lines were too thick, maybe I needed to, thin them out and make the features more dainty and delicate. So I tried doing that. And that still didn't fix it. In the end, I decided to try a darker blue because I thought that was more subtle. And I thought maybe that could help sort of, daintify the face. And so again, this is just on a new layer, so I am not doing anything that can't be undone, just testing this out to see and I ended up loving this look. I think that it was the sort of look that I was going for, and it allowed prominence to sit sort of with her beautiful hair, so I was really happy with that. So that was my piece in the end, and that's how I went about it. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I'm sorry for if my voice sounds a little bit weird. I've got a cut in my mouth, and so it's really painful talking, but you know, I've had quite a few requests about this particular style, so I really wanted to show you guys how I go through it, and hopefully maybe you picked up some tips or some tricks, or you have a style now that you want to try, or you want to add more texture to your work. But yeah, I'm really happy with this one. I think it turned out very dreamy and very beautiful. So yeah, I'll see you guys next Tuesday. Bye!